A fourth common approach patches together Bible passages, especially apocalyptic Bible passages. First, it decodes them to see what they really refer to, and then it strings them together into a timeline of the future, which is then understood as biblical. But it's not the timeline of Revelation. It's a timeline that includes snippets of Revelation, snippets of Daniel, snippets of Zechariah, snippets of the Gospels, snippets of Paul's letters, arranged according to really a logic, a sequence that's not innate to any of them. All right? So this is a very common approach, right? I'm thinking you've probably been aware of the Left Behind series. That timeline actually is the work of John Nelson Darby, a 19th century Irish evangelical, who is the founder of dispensationalism. Dispensationalism understands the world to be living under God's rule, which is expressed in a series of, or in a sequence of dispensations. The dispensation of law, then the dispensation of grace, the dispensation of the church, dispensation of the millennium. And each of these arrangements is kind of a distinct covenant with its own character to it. And he draws out a whole timeline putting together these different texts. I have a picture of it for you. This isn't a chart of the whole sequence from Adam all the way to Revelation 22, but it gives you a good sense of the complicated relationship of all the different events. So here on the left is what he calls the legal dispensation, when our relationship with God is characterized primarily by law. Israel, Temple, Sinai, Torah, etc. That leads up to the cross and Christ's ascension to serve as priest. Meanwhile, under his priestly lordship is the age of the church, the ecclesiastical dispensation. At the rapture, here's the rapture so-called. What's the rapture? 1 Thessalonians 4 describes Christ's return, at which time we'll be caught up together to meet him in the clouds. Now, interestingly, that's Christ's return. That's not 7 years before Christ's return. You can look it up. It's kind of like a Hollywood epic movie when the returning king with the troops is coming back to town and they open the gates and everyone in the town floods out to meet him. That's the image in 1 Thessalonians. It's like he's coming back and we're just lifted up to meet him in the middle. He's on his way down, so we return down with him. In 1 Thessalonians 4, we're not lifted up permanently. We're just coming out to greet him. Darby didn't read it that way. Darby read it as a rapture that took away the church from the earth. So the legitimate church leaves and is heavenly while the tribulation happens. With a false church, the Roman Catholic Church, but also with all those apostate Protestants that should have known better but didn't, the plagues happen in the book of Revelation. And then at the end comes Jesus and the church before the millennium. And now he's used Zechariah 14 here. He's used Revelation 19 up here, Revelation 17 here, so sort of trying to stay within Revelation's sequence. And then comes the millennium. Biological Israel, the Jews, aren't raptured, right, because they're not the church, but they do become believers during the millennium. And then the church is lifted up again in heaven while the earth burns and is remade. And then comes the descent of the New Jerusalem onto the new earth. That's a complicated picture. And I only gave you a few of the texts that he's worked into the timeline. So here's the sequence. Rapture before the tribulation. There's a really important theological reason for that. Darby and dispensationalists generally understand Christ's atonement as a substitutionary sacrifice, which means that the wrath of God that would have applied to Christians has already been poured out on the Son and no longer applies to Christians. So when the bowls of wrath, etc., are being poured out on the earth in Revelation, it makes no sense for the church to be on the receiving end of that wrath because it's already had that wrath removed by the blood of Christ. So the rapture happens as much for a theological reason as an exegetical reason. So then Jesus returns, the millennium happens, there's a great apostasy at the end of the millennium, just like in Revelation 20. Then comes the judgment at the end of Revelation 20, and then the new heavens, earth, and Jerusalem of Revelation 21. That's Darby's 19th century picture. It coincides with another decoding style approach of William Miller in the 19th century. Do you know about the Millerites? They end up predicting Christ returning in 1843. They had worked out the numbers from biblical events and sequences and thinking of a day as corresponding to 1,000 years because of this comment that's made in 2 Peter about how, God can be more patient than we are. It all gets worked into a timeline, and Miller insists that Jesus is coming on such and such a day in 1843. And his followers, the Millerites, they sold their stuff, they left their families, they went up on a mountain to wait and see and meet him, and nothing happened. It's called the Great Disappointment. He went back to the drawing board, figured out that he made a mistake. It was 1844. That didn't work out. Came up with a different time. That didn't work out. This split the movement, discouraged the movement. Some of them, though, became Seventh-day Adventists. All right, people awaiting the coming of Jesus. Others became Jehovah's Witnesses, who proclaimed that Jesus would return in 1914. And then 1975. So what people are doing is they're taking biblical texts that have numeric significance and they're decoding them and relating them together into one harmonization. Hal Lindsey sold tens of millions of books in the 70s doing this very same thing, working from the date of the restoration of the nation state of Israel and the recovery of Jerusalem in 1967. That was the generation that begins to see everything accomplished. The end of that generation would be 40 years at the maximum, 2007. That didn't work out. But we're pretty used to this, aren't we? How many of you have read or seen some of the Left Behind series? Wow, most of you. So that's just spruced up Darbyism. And here's where human wackiness comes in. No, it doesn't matter how many times this approach is disconfirmed. People keep trying it. Just like it doesn't matter how many times you read your horoscope and it doesn't happen the way you expect. You're going to read it again the next day. It doesn't matter how many times you lose the lottery. You're going to play again, and you're going to use your lucky numbers and your intuition. So the danger here is that hope, waiting for God's promised future, can yield to this attitude of calculating the return and even reading events in a superstitious fashion. Every time there's a big earthquake, people are like, oh, Jesus is coming, it's a big earthquake. There will be earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars at the end. Yeah, and there's also a San Andreas Fault in California, and it goes about every 100 years. This actually seems to be a license to indulge in calculations and superstitions. To speak positively of it, though, it also, it was really influential for me when I was a new and pretty superstitious. I don't even know if I was a Christian at that point, but I had absorbed a picture of the world where God wasn't really involved, and then a friend fed me Hal Lindsey books that his mom had given him. And even though they were dead wrong, they got a message through to me that was actually right, which is that God is actually involved in the world, that history is actually linear. And that shook me out of an attitude that the future would just be an ever-continuing present. That's one of many bad theologies that have blessed me in one way or another over the years.